elsewhere?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I suppose you want me to answer it. First of all, the outcome of the election will influence in some ways France, because what France is looking for, and don't forget what's happening in the Netherlands as well, they're looking for a kind of new constellation of European leaders. Someone will come after Merkel. If Macron wins, he will do a very careful realignment with the Dutch, and also if Scholz wins, it's very important for France. France would feel a little bit uncomfortable if Armin Laschet, head of the Conservative Democratic Union Party, won, because his heart isn't in the kind of European integration or the fiscal reform or even more economic integration, which actually Scholz now supports. So in that sense, France is very much looking at the constellation that will emerge here in Germany over the coming weeks. And this may actually not influence the outcome, but certainly give Macron new momentum if the SPD win.
That's interesting, because they put the two together. This is the future of Europe. Judy, always a pleasure. Great stuff. Thank you very much indeed. Judy Dempsey of Carnegie Europe. We're going to have much more coverage of what lies ahead for Germany. We've got a special coming up this week. Germany decides the CEO briefing with Bloomberg's Francine Lacqua. It happens Wednesday at 9 a.m. London time. What have we got coming up for you next? Well, it was quite a big weekend. We saw Raducanu winning the US Open. It was a sensational Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. Medvedev also winning as well. He's going to join us next. We're going to talk about the future of tennis. That's coming up. This is Bloomberg.
Months ends Monday.
So, what a weekend of tennis. Fans seeing history being made at the US Open, Flushing Meadow in New York. We saw Raducanu winning on Saturday nights here in the UK. An amazing game. What an amazing weekend of tennis. Let's deal with the details of what the business implications of all of this are. Laura Wright standing by.
Thanks, Kyle. Emma Raducanu's fairy tale run played out at Flushing Meadows. She did not drop a set the entire tournament, defeating fellow teenager Canadian Leylah Fernandez in the final. In the men's tournament, there was upset. Medvedev stopped Novak Djokovic from surpassing Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal's record of 20 Grand Slam majors. Now, it was interesting in the UK, Guy, because the only way to watch the US Open was via Amazon Prime. They have exclusive coverage. That was until Emma Raducanu secured her place in the women's final. Then it was reported by The Times that Channel 4 paid a seven-figure sum to Amazon Prime so that they could also broadcast the final. Now, for Amazon, this was a fantastic deal, bringing extra publicity to the Amazon platform, allowing them to reach a wider audience via terrestrial TV. In the UK, Amazon Prime is accessed in less households than their main competitor, Netflix. So subscription services, well, they account for around 7% of Amazon's total revenue. And you can see from my chart here that the revenue of subscription services has been increasing quarter on quarter, culminating in $8 billion in the second quarter of this year. But ultimately, it's about bringing more people onto the Amazon Prime platform, and live sports coverage is one way to do that going forward.
All right, Laura, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Great setup. Bloomberg's Laura Wright joining us there. Want to bring now in Bloomberg's Bonnie Quinn, who is standing by with the winner of the U.S. Open men's final, Russia's Daniil Medvedev. Bonnie?
Alex, thank you. Yes, Daniil in Midtown Manhattan today celebrating his big win, straight sets win, in fact, in Arthur Ashe Stadium last night. Daniil, congratulations. How are you feeling this morning when you woke up? What did it feel like to be the dream slayer, Djokovic's dream slayer?
Thanks a lot. I mean, first of all, didn't sleep a lot. Definitely slept like 3 hours. Didn't have a lot of time, but the main feeling is just happy. A lot of relief, a lot of happiness. Something I've been dreaming of as a child. Something first you dream of, but think you can never achieve, and then you understand that you're actually close to doing it. But talking about tennis as a sport, you never know until you do it that it's going to happen. So I'm really happy to manage to pull this one off, especially against Novak, one of the greatest tennis players of all time.
And one of your neighbours in Monaco. We'll get to that in a moment. The other thing that was difficult about last night's match is that the New York crowd was pretty intense. It was post-pandemic crowd. Everybody was so happy to be watching live sports. And, you know, you're talking about maybe 25,000 people at Arthur Ashe Stadium. They weren't necessarily on your side for some of the match. Was that difficult to deal with?
It was not easy at the end. I'm almost sure that it was not against me. It was for Novak because they wanted to witness history. It's completely understandable. And damn, it was really very tough at the end, especially when I didn't do the first championship point. I lost the game. They get into it even more. They understood that's the chance to bring back Novak. And it makes it even sweeter as a victory because it was, I mean, I have nothing more to add than it was super tough.
You had a nice conversation with Novak yesterday on the podium. Have you had a chat with him this morning or today since?
I haven't seen him since the match, but yeah, we get along pretty well. So
you'll definitely be facing each other again soon. So, Daniil, talk to us a little bit about the prize money. You've $2.5 million now in the bank, and obviously you live in Monaco, so taxes aren't an issue these days. Have you started investing your money, and what do you do with it?
Well, first of all, I still have to pay tax in New York State, so that's the first part of the story. But of course, yeah, I try to take care of my money. I won't make it public, but I don't spend all the check in the first night. That's for sure.
Naomi Osaka was talking about looking at crypto. She's not in there yet, but is that the type of thing you'd be looking at? Or, you know, she invests in Sweet Green, for example. Are people coming to you with ideas?
Crypto is not my thing, but yeah, I definitely have people helping me in this topic, and I trust them because, again, everybody knows how to do well their job. I know well how to win tennis matches, and I have other people around me who knows well what to do with the money. And if it's crypto, but so far it hasn't been.
The PTPA is making an effort to up the prize money for players. Is that something that you're behind? Do you think players get enough of the revenue from tennis, from the tour?
That's actually a very tough and interesting question, which I think we could go on for hours. I always said that PTPA is still a young story, and I don't want to rush into it. Neither saying that it's bad for tennis and it has no sense. Neither saying that I'm completely up for it and completely behind it. I think they're trying to do something good and something new, but again, I need to wait some time to decide and to see if it's good for tennis or no. Talking about the revenue, the question is about the percentage of how much Grand Slams earn and how much we get, because that's a question. They also spend a lot of money in the Grand Slams, and of course there was the pandemic. So it's a question that I think is gonna go for some years on. Hopefully it's going to resolve as in any other sport, because again, tennis is a big sport and I'm sure there are solutions.
And certainly grassroots tennis grew by 20% during the pandemic, so that was good for the base. Daniel, I do want to ask you about the pandemic and vaccinations. Only about 50% of players chose to get vaccinated. Why the reluctance among tennis players to get vaccinated?
Well, to be honest, I'm actually surprised always by the numbers, because for many players I talk to, I think it's a very private matter, and of course between each other we talk about this, and I'm almost 100% sure that it's more than 50%. And so when I see these numbers in media, I'm just asking myself, how do they know? So again, tennis is such an individual sport that and many of us again are playing against each other every day. It's one against one, so many of us want to keep our medical history private, not only talking about pandemic and COVID, but about everything, because everything can be beneficial to win the match. So I'm just interested where they get these numbers.
Well, certainly the crowd each had at least one dose, and everybody was very, very thrilled to be able to go and watch. You provided some great entertainment yesterday, and we will see you again in New York. Daniil Medvedev, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me.
Great interview, Vonnie. Fantastic stuff. What a weekend of tennis. Absolutely amazing. Vonnie Quinn speaking with the Men's Open champion Daniil Medvedev. Okay. Russian market, out of interest, trading a little bit higher today, so maybe that's one area that he may want to take a look at. So energy stocks generally actually are doing quite well. So the Russian market is up. The European markets broadly are higher. The London market is outperforming a little bit versus the CAC 40, but pretty much neck and neck with the DAX today. Energy stocks up there, auto stocks up there, seems to be the narrative. Let's show you what's happening with the Stoxx 600, give you an idea of what the session has looked like thus far, because we're definitely off our earlier highs. As you can see, midway through the day, we were certainly feeling a lot more positive. The buy the dip mentality was in. We've certainly nosedived off that towards the back end of the day here in Europe. The inflation narrative is certainly a big feature. Keep an eye on what is happening with energy costs around Europe. You can take a look at what's happening in Germany today, pushing ever higher, the UK as well. UK nat gas prices up to a record today. Electricity prices pushing higher and higher. It's going to be a very interesting winter. Now, there's a push across here. So you've got UK nat gas prices pushing up. Brent is also now becoming part and parcel of this narrative as well, as we watch what is happening. As you see, it's sort of almost a substitution effect. Where do I get my calories from is the real question here. If gas prices are shooting up, maybe the calorific value of Brent becomes a little bit more valuable. And we're certainly seeing that. But gas prices in the UK today up by nearly 6%. Brent crude rising, we're up by around 0.8%. We are starting to see aluminium just pitching over a little bit. Aluminum down by 1%. Obviously, a huge rally north of 3,000 earlier, just beginning to fade a little bit. But it's been certainly meteoric, the price action we've seen in aluminium over the last few days. In terms of the stock setup, as I say, we've seen energy doing relatively well today. We're seeing the auto sector tracking a little bit higher too. That's why Germany and the UK may be getting a little bit of outperformance here. So energy's the lead gainer, up by nearly 3%. The car sector's up by 1.77. Banks, utilities, insurance, all tracking higher. Bottom end of the market, you've got retail, you've got technology, you've got healthcare. Down there at the bottom, some of the consumer luxury stocks also just giving back a little bit of ground today. We're also seeing some weakness in the aviation sector. Let's talk about some of the individual stocks. Royal Mail tracking higher today. Apparently it's going to start delivering parcels for Amazon. huge shortage of truck drivers in the UK at the moment. Distribution is going to be a key story as we head up towards the festivities around Christmas. So Royal Mail tracking higher there. I put Rusal in as well on that aluminium story, up a little bit more earlier. We're tracking up by 1.19% there. And then there's EasyJet. Huge story at the back end of last week. We've got commentary over the weekend from Michael O'Leary over at Ryanair suggesting that EasyJet and Wizz should get together. Otherwise, they are ultimately going to be taken out. EasyJet coming into the market, raising a huge amount of money. There's also speculation, potentially, Alex, that we could be seeing IAG do the same thing. But it's going to be interesting to see as well how the credit market handles this. The credit market, in some ways, has given some of these airlines a fairly straightforward route, particularly in the United States. Does that pressure start to mount up? Maybe as it becomes clear that actually the journey back to normality is going to be a little longer than maybe we all thought.
Yeah, but huge issuance from the airline guys in the credit market, pretty much anywhere you look, whether Europe or U.S. Let's get more insight on that with Luke Hickmore, Aberdeen Standard Investments investment director. Luke, you're also sort of an airline credit guy. That was your specialty in a past life. What do you think? Are we going to have to see more consolidation? And how does the credit outlook look for these guys?
I think we have to see more consolidation. If you look, cash flow, return on investment, really just Ryanair and Wizz were making money pre-COVID. So, and that points to a oversupplied industry. You know, we were seeing 8,000 odd flights a day in Spain, but still seeing the prices come down. And it feels, you know, it's going to take a long time to get back there. We need to see the consolidation to get it more cost effective, more profitable as an industry, and that makes a big difference for us as credit investors. We don't really want to be on the side of the person doing the acquisitions. We want to be on the side of the people who get bought out by hopefully a better quality one. So people like EasyJet, where you could look at them as an investment grade company and it looks like a pretty decent kind of business, actually may not be the best place to be at the moment until we know what their eventual outcome's going to be. IAG as well, you know, difficult, trouble with their balance sheet right now. It'll get better. I think actually by 2023 they'll be looking for bolt-ons, and EasyJet could be one of those coming in as well. But we do need to see those numbers coming back and cash flow coming back in the industry. I think some of the other big carriers around Europe have got all sorts of problems. People like Lufthansa and Air France, KLM, we could sell them selling off bits of their fleet quite easily.
Luke, I'm really struggling, and to your point about kind of the legacy carriers out of continental Europe, I'm struggling to see where the acquirers come from. Why would Ryanair, I can't see MLA or Michael O'Leary being interested in anything other than organic growth, i.e. taking advantage of the weakness that is elsewhere. EasyJet will see what Johan does. IAG maybe when the balance sheet gets sorted out. But there does seem to be a lack of acquirers. The strong companies, why aren't they just simply going to sit back and wait for the capacity to come out of the market and then take advantage of it?
Well, interestingly, Ryanair have quietly done a bit of M&A, of course, over the last few years. They bought Lauda Air, and it's not been a particularly successful acquisition. And I guess that's coloured some of his thinking over the weekend. But, you know, if an opportunity comes up, they won't stand by and let it happen, especially if it happens to be a Boeing fleet, which is, of course, what Ryanair is through and through. It's grown in the 747, and they've got big orders for another 200 of the 747 MAX. Now, if they can get somebody in that space as well, then it works for them. Without that, I think it's really difficult. IAG, if we're a year and a half, 2 years down the line, and cash flows start to come back for them, they are set up for acquisitions. That is how the company's structure works. So you could see it, but perhaps maybe not immediately.
So, Luke, when we would think, say, a year ago about travel coming back, the benchmark was like travel would come back. Like it'd be like full pre-pandemic travel, everything's open, everything's great. If we deal with this like a flu season and we still have some vaccine resistance, what's like your new normal then when it comes to air travel?
Well, I think if we're talking short haul, we're probably next summer. Maybe next summer leaking into Q3, Q4 before we're back to 2019 levels. But long haul's the problem now, and long haul remains, I think, one where it's really difficult to see, and I'm sorry for this, the flight path back to normality in that space. And it's a big issue for the legacy carriers, right? I mean, the most profitable route in the world, the New York, London Heathrow route, is not earning the kind of money that BA needs it to earn. So that could take until 2023, maybe even into 2024, which is a problem. Lufthansa now majority owned by the German government.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to fly to the United States. It's quite all right, Luke. I'd love to be able to fly to the United States. There's an IATA briefing coming up, an AGM coming up at the beginning of next month. Quite hard to get in at the moment, which, as you say, is something of a surprise, given the fact that we do see vaccination rates pretty similar on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, Europe looks like it's ahead now. If that is the case, what is the future for this industry in Europe and in the United States? Long haul was a huge profit driver. The front of the plane, business class, a huge profit driver. We are seeing costs going up. We're going to see costs going up even more once environmental standards come in. It feels like we are at the beginning of what could be a very difficult journey for the aviation sector. Do you think creditors are fully recognizing that at the moment? At the moment, it is relatively easy to borrow for an airline. Why do you think the credit market is being so benevolent right now, given the headwinds that are coming?
Well, we've come into this crisis with a lot of carriers holding the planes on the balance sheet rather than leases. So they've been able to tap into that as a source of financing. And possibly there's a little more room for that to go on from here. But the point there, Guy, I think a really big one is how they cope with environmental changes that they are going to have to put in place on their fleets. You need a good balance sheet to bring in the new planes which reduce the emissions and move you forward in terms of the environmental impact that you're having. Now, if you're a legacy carrier, you've borrowed an awful lot of money like Lufthansa or Air France KLM, that's a really difficult position to be in, to persuade the government to put more money in to buy more planes. So I think people like Ryanair again and Wizz Air and to some degree IAG are actually leading in this in terms of reducing their environmental impact, and it'll make all the difference for us. But look, business class travel for business people, I think, may be something that takes even longer to come back. I actually had a client visit our offices a week and a half ago from Germany. That was the first time we'd had somebody visit in a year and a half. What a pleasure it was. But that was just local, short haul. And I think actually travelling over to Asia or America right now is just off the cards.
It is.
Uh-oh.
Sorry to say.
Let me reassure you of the fact that it is incredibly difficult. You could, if you're an American, Alex can come over here, no problem at all. As long as she's got the paperwork all lined up, it's good to go. Okay.
We would have all
thank
loved
you very
to
much
be at the US
indeed.
Open.
That is definitely true. I'd like to go to the IATA events, the AGM there. It's kind of ironic that given that's a huge travel event, that I can't make it. Anyway, Luke Hickmore of Aberdeen Standard Investments, greatly appreciated. Let's take a look at the final numbers. These are the stories that we're watching here in Europe as they've developed. The FTSE 100 outperforming a little bit, as is the DAX, the CAC 40, some of the luxury stocks just giving back a little bit of ground they picked up towards the back end of the last week. Energy and autos. That is where the market is here in Europe today. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets, the European Close. I'm Rich Gupta, and you're looking at a live shot of the principal room. Coming up, University of California, Irvine's Mahindra Baradaran at 4:30 p.m. in New York, 9:30 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.
Just some breaking news for you. Democrats are planning, quote, meaningful change to the cap on SALT deduction. It's a state and local tax deduction. It's how much you're able to write off in terms of your mortgage on your taxes. And it's huge for people who live in New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, etc. It's been a big issue. Moderate Democrats have been really pushing to raise that cap. It looks like they're proposing a meaningful change. We'll keep you updated on that as it crosses, Guy.
Yeah, we'll get more details on that. Obviously, hugely important to a huge number of people in the
One
New York
sitting
area.
right here.
I was about to say, I'm sure you're paying attention to this one with a great deal of interest. Let's talk about what's happening with the virus, because we can't keep sort of our eye off that for too long. The latest numbers, obviously, well, certainly here in the UK, fairly stable, but fairly stable at a reasonably elevated level. Here's the WHO Special Envoy on COVID-19, David Nabarro, talking about variant risk.
Whilst there is virus circulating in the unvaccinated world, there are huge risks of variants emerging that will eventually be able to beat the vaccines that we're using in the UK, in the US, and in Europe. So we're in a very unstable situation. Please let's slow down, look at the world as a whole, and develop a response plan for the whole world and do it properly.
The view from the WHO. Sam Fazeli, Senior Pharmaceutical Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, joining me now on set. A rare privilege to have Mr. Fazeli here, Dr. Fazeli. Let's talk a little bit about what has just been said. What is the best use of our vaccines right now?
Yes, I was on that call actually, Guy, and I have to say the best use has to be driven by data. Excuse me. Until we know for sure that we are not getting breakthrough rises in severe infections, and I don't think we've seen the data to suggest that yet, but that doesn't mean that it won't happen, then I don't think it's right to just assume that this vaccine, you don't need the third shot. If we start seeing that, and you've given all your vaccine away, you don't look very clever. On the other hand, we do have lots of people in the developing nations, excuse me, that still need a shot.
You got there.
Yeah, don't worry, Guy. Well,
how far away are you?
We'll find out. Yeah,
You're definitely
not far
6 feet.
enough for Delta, I can tell you that.
Hey,
so
Sam.
the issue is, yeah.
So if that's part of the problem with the booster, I just read a headline that like Israel is looking at a 4th dose. I mean, why can't we all get our ducks in a row here?
Yeah, I mean, that might just be talk. Let's just wait and see. And, you know, a population of 10 million people, it's easy to say we'll give them a 3rd shot, a 4th shot, or whatever else. So the point is we need to see the data from Israel, which I think is absolutely critical, on what happens with severe infections after just 2 doses and the timing of that. If you're not seeing any waning, then, you know, the argument does stack against giving 3rd shots.
Let's talk about what's happening here in the UK. News today that potentially we're going to give 12 to 15-year-olds 1 shot of the Pfizer jab. You're shaking your head. I thought the Pfizer dose was a relatively low-dose shot anyway. Is this the compromise?
No, but I just love the UK because they can't stop tinkering. First it was, okay, we're not going to do 3 weeks' time, we're going to do 12 weeks, which turned out to be okay. Then AstraZeneca vaccine and some questions there. And now we're running around with no masks on subways and things. A lot of people aren't. I don't know about
you can't go on the subways. The trains you can, the subways you can't.
Oh, tube, you have to wear a mask?
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to see that. I haven't tried it yet. But all I'm saying is that we do like to kind of mess about. And here is a little bit of, you know, scientifically, there's no data. But these are experts. There's 4 of them. And they've been looking at vaccines and vaccinations for years. I learned to eat humble pie when I had a go at them at the idea of expanding or extending that interval. So therefore, I'm going to continue to remind myself that these guys perhaps know better than most of us.
I don't know, Sam. You're pretty awesome. We're going to continue the conversation with Sam Fazeli on radio, DAB Digital Radio, the cable at 12 p.m., 5 p.m. over in London. Sam Fazeli of Bloomberg Intelligence. Just to recap some of these headlines here, Democrats are now planning, quote, meaningful change to the cap on SALT deductions. It would potentially then enable homeowners to deduct more interest on their mortgage on their taxes. It's a huge contentious issue. We'll get more updates for you in just a moment. This is Bloomberg.
With you.
All right, so more on that headline. Democrats planning meaningful change to the cap on SALT deduction. Joining us now, Bloomberg's Balance of Power anchor, David Westin. All right, David, what would that actually entail as far as we know?
Yeah, well, this is potentially big news for you and for me, Alex. I'm not sure for Guy, but for you and for me, because it's really cash in our bank account. As you know, what they did under President Trump is they really limited the amount you could deduct from the income that you're reporting to the federal government to pay taxes on when it comes to state and local taxes. That's the SALT. And now we have two members of the House Ways and Means Committee, not coincidentally, a New York and a New Jersey congressman who are really affected by this, saying there's going to be meaningful reform here. Basically, they said specifically that they're going to undo the short-sighted capping of SALT by Republicans. So, I mean, we don't want to get too far over skis, but Alex, you and I might have some more cash in our bank account here.
David, how is this going to affect the calculation? I thought the idea was at the moment that we needed to raise taxes and make sure that this package could be paid for. The more taxes that can be raised, the closer we get to $3.5 trillion.
This does not help on that. There's no question about it, Guy. The reason they put the limitation on SALT on originally was to be able to pay for the last tax cuts, to come up with more revenue. If they reverse some or all of that, that's going to reduce the revenue, so they're going to have to make up for it somewhere else. Although, as you know, they're proposing just today, the Democrats, a wide variety of things, including a surtax on people making more than $5 million a year that they say could really raise a fair amount of money.
What is like a Bernie Sanders going to think about this, or an AOC?
Well, I don't want to speak for them. Sure. I would not be shocked if they didn't like it, because the basic perception, the argument for some of the most progressive people, and including AOC, who's been against a limitation of the SALT reduction, is that this benefits wealthier people as a practical matter. Those are the people who are paying the taxes to begin with, and that as a practical matter, this does not help the poorer people. So I wouldn't be surprised if they're not very excited about it.
Do you think it's going to stop people going to Florida?
Well, there's a big question, Guy, about how many people really are going to Florida as a practical matter. but that was one of the arguments made. You're exactly right. People are saying that people go south because they don't have to pay as many taxes. So maybe some of those hedge funds will come back. You don't know.
All right, David, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Bloomberg's David Weston joining us there. And stay with David because on television he'll be talking to Michael Zazas, but Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. Public Policy Research on Balance of Power, kind of next on Bloomberg Television and Radio. But, Guy, I think it also just sort of puts in a focus where we are in terms of the infrastructure bill and the pay-fors. And this obviously going to be, as you pointed out, a big question mark.
The pay-fors are really important. And actually, I thought David did a good job of kind of pointing me back towards that extra levy that we've seen announced over the last 24 hours. You wonder whether actually that was done with some foresight to this news maybe coming out to ultimately end up balancing each other out. So it becomes a little less regressive than maybe it would have first been. So it keeps the likes of AOC maybe on board. We will see. So we came into the show 2.5 hours ago, me asking you the question, what was the most important thing for Alex Steele today? Was it your daughter going back to school? Was it the fact that energy prices are going? I've now figured it out. It's neither of those two things. Looks like it's salt.
Salt, kid going back to school, energy prices. We're going to radio. This is Bloomberg.
From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power with David Weston.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters listeners in New York, to our television and radio audiences worldwide. Welcome to Balance of Power. It's a busy day up on Capitol Hill with the Senate back in session and House Democrats releasing their proposed tax package. To set up the week for us, we turn now to our Washington correspondent, Joe Matthew, host of Sound On Bloomberg Radio every afternoon at 5 o'clock. So, Joe, thanks so much for being with us. We heard earlier in the day some of the proposals coming out of the Democrats about how they're going to raise more money to pay for some of the $3.5 trillion. But just before we made air, then we heard that the Democrats are proposing meaningful changes to the SALT limitations. That's state and local tax limitations on deductions. That's big news for a lot of our audience.
That's for sure, and it's one that we were talking about just a couple of weeks ago, David. It reminds us of the ping-ponging that we've had in this debate. We seem to focus on something different every day. This was a very big deal for the group of moderate Democrats in the House that had really slowed this debate to a halt. Josh Gottheimer, one of them from New Jersey. It's really Democrats from high tax states like New Jersey who want to see this happen and see the cap lifted again, having been changed in the 2017 tax law. This is not going to go over well, however, with progressives. We're going to have a whole new debate to sort out here, David, as AOC, right, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has called this repeatedly a gift to billionaires, a giveaway to the rich. On the other hand, Speaker Pelosi says this is a meaningful component of reconciliation as this bill moves forward. This, of course, comes on top of all the other numbers that we saw this morning with the House Ways and Means Committee, to your point, David, suggesting a corporate tax rate of 26.5%. That's less than Joe Biden had asked for, and a capital gains tax rate of 25%, also less than Joe Biden asked for. You can rest assured all these numbers are going to change. This all has to go back through the Senate, and you've got a lot of Democrats who aren't happy with every number they're seeing here, David.
Yeah, before we're done here, ping pong may be the polite way to describe what we're going to see going forward. But let me just raise one possibility. It's early going. This is speculative. Yep. You're absolutely right. AOC does not like the idea of cutting back on the limits on SALT. On the other hand, as I recall, part of that package out earlier this morning was a surtax on people making more than $5 million a year, a pretty substantial surcharge. Is it possible there's a trade-off going on? Because that certainly would be something that I think AOC, Bernie Sanders, would like pretty well.
You've put your finger on something there, and that also helps to bring the overall number, David, closer to what President Biden wanted. If the corporate tax rate, the capital gains tax rate falls short, you're right. This 3% surcharge on people making over $5 million a year, they say would generate $127 billion. That brings us to almost $3 trillion in what Democrats say they can pay for here. And a lot of questions today about what Joe Manchin on the Senate side might have to say about that. His biggest concern has not only been the price tag, but deficit spending. Democrats say they've got that figured out in this plan.
Oh, yeah, Joe Manchin. We heard from him over the weekend, didn't we? Thank you so much to Bloomberg's Joe Matthew. He is host of Bloomberg's Radio Sound On. That's every day at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Radio. There's a lot of negotiation left to be done on the reconciliation package and taxes that we've just been talking with Joe about. But for his analysis of what's likely to get done in the end and when, welcome now Michael Zezas. He is Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. Public Policy Research. So you're going to be a very busy man over the next 2 or 3 weeks, Michael. So
already am.
Thank you for being with us today. First, react to what we're hearing on the tax front, because as I said, we heard earlier today about an overall package, some of the things including increase in corporate rates, things like that. Now we're hearing about possible cutback on the SALT limitations. What do you think is going on?
Well, we're frankly not surprised to hear about what's going on with SALT. It's long been our base case that you would see major relief here. At the end of the day, it was really just about counting the votes. There were about 20, I think maybe it was 21 House members who had signed their name to a caucus saying that they wouldn't be able to sign on to an infrastructure deal unless they got this done. That, with a very thin majority and a big opportunity inside of a $3.5 trillion reconciliation shell, means that there's probably enough pieces to move around to accommodate a block of votes that big. So I don't think that was particularly surprising. I also don't think it was particularly surprising that the corporate tax rate came out at 26.5%. We think they'll end up at 25%. There was a lot of, I think, recognition of what could actually get consensus and very slim majorities in the Democratic Party. And now, of course, we need to see how much spending can be agreed upon. And obviously some of these tax provisions are still going to change as they go through the Senate, as you mentioned earlier.
Well, part of the issue here, as I understand it, Michael, is that you've got such a narrow majority in both houses, they can't really afford to lose anybody on the Democrat side. And the concern is if you do something like a limitation on the SALT reduction, then you may actually lose some of the more progressives. Are there things in this tax package that might make it up to them?
Well, I think it's possible, but what I think is probably more telegraphing of what's actually been going on here for a long time is you've had House leadership, Senate Democratic leadership, kind of concede the point that the state and local tax deduction relief would have to happen, and have made statements as such. And therefore, it's probably not surprising to progressives that this is out there. And so, therefore, I think behind the scenes, you would probably have some recognition that this relief has to be there. It's a question of how you can get the progressive part of the caucus on board with this. So if the tax code is being made sufficiently progressive as a net result of all the moving parts that are going on here, then you could probably build the coalition that you need to get the votes done.
So, Michael, one of the people we heard from over the weekend was the senator from West Virginia, Mr. Joe Manchin. And as I heard him talk on ABC and other places over the weekend, he seemed to be saying, look, I don't want to borrow a lot more money, so I want to make sure we pay for it. But beyond that, I'm also concerned about the competitiveness of U.S. industry. And if you really ramp up the rates too high, we're not going to be as competitive. Talk about that. Are they doing this in such a way that we will not lose competitive edge internationally?
Well, I think it's a question for a different expert, but in terms of what moderates think needs to be done to the tax code or can be done to the tax code while maintaining competitiveness, they're probably looking at measures like the OECD average statutory tax rate for different countries. That's probably why the 25% rate is something that Senator Manchin has thrown out in the past. It's why it's in our base case that that's as high as you could go. And so ultimately, I think a lot of these tax provisions that I've thrown out there, while they're quite close to what our base case is, there's probably room for them to come down a bit. And while I don't expect this to be highly publicized, what's going to bridge the gap here is the sort of permissiveness around allowing deficits to go a little bit higher than folks are talking about, because there's not a lot of political feedback that we think is negative, at least when you look at polling data, that voters might give the Democratic Party for allowing the deficit to expand. And they've got plenty of air cover from economists to go ahead and do so.
Maybe American people are not that worried with the deficit limit, but there's a limit that Congress has imposed on itself that they're bumping up against, as well as an issue of refunding the government by the end of this month. What is the risk? What risk do you put on the possibility we might actually shut down the government at the end of the month?
I mean, a shutdown, I think, is a tougher one to handicap. But, I mean, the debt limit here is obviously critically important. We don't think that there's going to be a problem with getting the debt limit raised in a timely way. And to be clear, when I say timely, we're talking about before the Treasury's X date, which our economists have pegged around the beginning of November. There's a couple of options here. There's obviously pairing it with the CR, which the Democrats want to do. There's the fail-safe for putting it into the reconciliation bill. You know, at the end of the day, though, there will probably be a fair amount of drama around this. So I wouldn't expect the market to be completely inoculated against this. In particular, you should look at the bills market. This is a place where in the past, when you've had these types of drama, you start to see an inversion of the bills curve on the short end. That's probably where we're going to see the market react here.
So they're going to have to do something, continuing resolution or otherwise, to keep the government open by the end of this month. But what about the reconciliation? What about the infrastructure? Because, again, we heard from Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, over the weekend, that said, you know, this can go into November. He's not too worried about it.
Yeah. Well, I think that's probably right. Our base case all along has been that this is probably a fourth quarter event. So some of the deadlines that have been put out there, you know, including by the moderates that wanted to see a vote on the bipartisan plan by September 27th, and then kind of the follow-on by the progressives saying we have to tie a reconciliation package to that. I think practically speaking, all of that is malleable. And so this negotiation is probably going to go on and kind of, it's going to certainly occupy my time deep into the fourth quarter.
As I say, you're going to be a busy man, so thank you for spending some time with us today.
That's
Michael Zezas. He is Morgan Stanley, head of U.S. Public Policy Research. Coming up, Secretary of State Tony Blinken faces the House Foreign Affairs Committee this afternoon. We talk with one of those who will be asking the questions, Congresswoman and U.S. Air Force veteran Chrissy Houlihan of Pennsylvania. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio.
temperature changes.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. COVID-19 vaccines work so well that most people don't yet need a booster. That's according to a new report from an all-star panel of scientists from around the world, including two prominent experts from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. They say none of the studies they reviewed show credible evidence of substantially declining protection from the vaccines, and there could be more side effects if boosters come out too soon or too broadly. House Democrats have drafted a package of tax increases that falls short of President Biden's ambition. Bloomberg has learned the proposal would raise the top corporate tax rate from 21% to 26.5%, less than the 28% the president had wanted. The top rate on capital gains would rise from 20% to 25% instead of the 39.6% the president proposed. The package of proposals is estimated to raise more than $2 trillion. Senator Joe Manchin is casting doubt on the timeline for pushing President Biden's economic agenda through Congress. The West Virginia Democrat suggests that a late September target for a House vote on infrastructure spending is unrealistic. Manchin's vote is crucial in the evenly split Senate. He has renewed his objections to the $3.5 trillion proposal. The global nuclear watchdog says its surveillance of Iran's atomic program is back on track. The International Atomic Energy Agency has struck a pact with Tehran that allows monitors to replace damaged surveillance cameras and memory cards at Iranian atomic sites. The agreement avoids a sharp escalation in tensions over Iran's nuclear activity and offers diplomats hope to revive a 2015 agreement that curbed the program more time. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thank you so much, Mark. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to face the House Foreign Affairs Committee this afternoon with questions focused on the disorderly United States withdrawal from Afghanistan. We welcome now a member of that committee, Congresswoman Chrissy Houlihan, Democrat of Pennsylvania, who herself is an Air Force veteran. So welcome, Congresswoman. Good to have you back with us. Give us a sense of what you're going to be looking for out of Secretary Blinken this afternoon.
Thanks again for having me. I'm looking forward to the opportunity to seeing Secretary Blinken and asking him questions, all of the ones that you've outlined in terms of why are we where we are, what happened in Afghanistan over the course of the several weeks of evacuation and withdrawal, how could we have done it better? But actually, to be honest, my very first question, if I'm able to ask, will be, can you stay long enough for all of the members of Congress to be able to ask their questions of you? He's currently not scheduled to stay long enough. Only about two-thirds of the members of our committee will be able to ask questions. And I really think that as the responsibility of Congress to provide oversight, it would be very appropriate if he was able to stay long enough for all of us to be able to ask critical questions.
Well, I have to confess that's interesting to me because it's pretty clear why you want to talk with him. It's a pretty big subject. Is that typical for them to really put a hard out on the time that they're going to have to be leaving?
It's not atypical, but it is not, I think, at this particular time appropriate. We are a committee of more than 50 members. Each one of us has allocated about 5 minutes of time. I think it is important that we be able to have a civil, calm conversation about what's going on in Afghanistan and what has transpired in, frankly, the last 20 years. We have questions about why Bagram was shut down. We have questions about timeline. We have questions about women and girls and about the intelligence that we're going to be having on an ongoing basis from the area. And I think it's appropriate that we have the time to ask those questions. And I think it's appropriate by the members of my committee that we also do that in a very civil and decent manner, rather than what I anticipate will be a contentious sort of mudslinging environment, which I think also is not appropriate.
Well, in the spirit of trying to be constructive, I'm curious, you serve on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You also serve on the Armed Services Committee. As I said, you are a veteran. You served as an officer in the Air Force. Do you have a sense that perhaps part of what happened was because of the need for force protection, that the Pentagon was really concerned if you don't get these people out of there fast, that we might put our forces at risk?
I think it's entirely possible that there are very reasonable explanations for a lot of the things that we saw from the outside that looked like they didn't make a ton of sense. And that's what it's our responsibility to do, is ask those questions, get those sorts of explanations. And that's where I am hopeful that in this hearing and in subsequent ones, we'll be able to drill down on that. As you mentioned, I'm on the Foreign Affairs Committee, but I'm also on the Armed Services Committee, and would expect that there would be parallel committee hearings as well, on maybe with the Secretary of Defense as an example.
There's a lot of questions we ask about what happened going backward, but let's talk about what is going to happen going forward with Afghanistan. A lot of concern, particularly on the anniversary of the 20th anniversary of 9/11, about possible future attacks based in Afghanistan. As somebody who knows armed forces, as somebody who knows the Air Force, how confident are you that we can use some of our air resources to really prevent future attacks on the United States based in Afghanistan?
Sure, and indeed those are some of the questions that I know that I and my colleagues will be asking, which is about how we will be able to be successful in collecting intelligence coming out of Afghanistan and making sure that we're suppressing any threat that comes out of Afghanistan as we move forward. But also importantly, one of the reasons why the president pulled out of Afghanistan, and why frankly so many administrations before wanted to do the same, is that there are threats frankly all over the world that we need to be worried about, terroristic threats all over the world. So this is not a unique part of the world, unfortunately. This is just one of many places in the world where we need to be attentive to terrorist threats.
Beyond oversight, you obviously have responsibility for legislation. Let's talk about the National Defense Authorization Act, because I know you've been very involved in that, trying to work bipartisan way to try to get some reforms made. Give us a sense of what you think is important and what's coming up.
Sure, and what's interesting about this is one of the very few pieces of legislation, the NDAA, that actually comes out successfully year after year from Congress and from the Senate. My areas of focus are very broad, but one in particular that I'm passionate about is national service writ large, not only in the military, but also community service, such as City Year, Peace Corps, those kinds of things. And so some of that I've been focusing on through the NDAA is exactly related to community service. And one in particular is expanding the selective service process to include women. I'm happy to say that bipartisanly and bicamerally, we were able to vote through that. We now, if this is indeed decided upon by the conference of the Senate and the House and signed into law by the president, we are able to have full equality in our access to making sure that we have all people in the United States being part of the selective service process and serving our nation.
We have a long way to go to figure out the aftermath of Afghanistan as a practical matter, but from where you sit and with your expertise, on the one hand, do you think that we may have put ourselves in a more vulnerable position because we've communicated to the world that we are vulnerable and you can attack us? Or is it possible we might be stronger because we can consolidate our forces and not be extended too far?
You know, I think those are very complicated questions to pair together. I think one of the larger reasons that we needed to pull out of Afghanistan was to make sure that we could cover down in other areas where the threats were larger. We have limited resources. We are one of the most vast militaries on this planet, if not the most vast, but we need to make sure that we're looking really hard at where all of the threats are coming from. And they are evolving rapidly, whether they're biosecurity, cybersecurity, threats with China, threats with Russia. All of those kinds of things have to be weighed with the current view of what threats in Afghanistan, as an example, look like. And so we need to make sure that we have the strongest posture that we possibly can. And I believe that we're trying to balance that out as best as we're able to as a force.
Finally, you mentioned China as a potential threat, or at least sort of a challenge when we look at the South China Sea, for example. How pressing is that risk to the United States, and what resources do we need to be able to really counteract it?
It's very pressing, and it's very worrisome, and it's actually something that we can bipartisanly agree upon here in this body, is that China is somebody, a nation that needs to be watched very, very cautiously and warily. And in fact, in the next couple of weeks, many of the subcommittees that I serve on Foreign Affairs and Armed Services are going to be meeting about the threat of China, and specifically with relationship to Taiwan and their place within the Pacific Rim. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to kind of move forward in moving our gaze, potentially over towards to Asia.
Congresswoman, thank you so very much. We really appreciate it every time you're on with us. That's Representative Chrissy Houlihan, Democrat of Pennsylvania. Coming up, the crisis in China over Evergrande. It is our stock of the hour, and that's coming up next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Giant Chinese property company Evergrande is facing financial difficulties, and it is affecting Chinese home buyers and retail investors and perhaps the entire system. It's our stock of the hour, and Dave Wilson is here to tell us the story. So, Dave, you and I were talking earlier. I knew there was an issue with Evergrande. I didn't realize it was this big or this bad.
And it's been long-lasting, too. You know, at this time last year, they were warning that they might go into default. And then they got some help from their shareholders, from companies tied to local governments in China. You know, they took 3 units public. I mean, they've been doing all kinds of things. Buying back shares to try and lift their price. Same with their bonds. It hasn't worked out so well, though, especially now. You know, you have this issue with what's called wealth management products. Basically high-yield investments, you know, no guarantees with them. And, you know, mom and pop investors have been buying them. And so now, you know, with Evergrande not being able to keep up the payments, there are a lot of protests going on against this company. And by the way, even some of the employees are involved. That's how bad it's gotten. But just to understand what we're talking about here, Evergrande in the last year, about $300 billion in liabilities. And that's dollar bonds, it's loans, it's down payments from people buying houses from this company. It's all of that. And it's really ballooned over the last several years. And the problem is China last October started coming out with stricter regulations in terms of borrowing, what they call 3 red lines. And this year, Evergrande has been trying to get its business into line with those 3 red lines, but they've had, you know, their challenges, and they have more coming up. You know, you look out to January of next year, you see something like $1.4 billion of payments that are due in interest on dollar-denominated debt. I mean, they have so much to deal with going forward. And now you have the issue of what's happening domestically with, you know, people not being happy that they're not getting their checks.
Well, as you say, there are really demonstrations in the streets, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So can the Chinese government afford to let Evergrande go bankrupt?
Well, that becomes the bigger question, really. I mean, is this company too big to fail? Considering all the strings that have been pulled to prop up Evergrande over time, and some of those tied into government through government-controlled companies, at least locally, you know, the question does become, what does the national government do? You know, they've gone through it in the past with the biggest banks, and so now, you know, they're kind of being confronted with what Evergrande is going through and how they're going to respond.
It's really quite a story. Thank you so much for bringing it to us. That's Dave Wilson, our stocks editor. Coming up here, counting down to California's recall election, Claremont McKenna College professor of American politics, Jack Pitney, who's a real expert on California politics. He's going to be with us to take us through where we are on the eve of the recall election. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you very much. If you're looking for light at the end of the COVID tunnel over the next 3 to 6 months, scientists have a reality check. Brace for more of the same. They say the race between the variants and the vaccines won't be over until everyone is either vaccinated or has been infected. Scientists predict outbreaks will close schools, renew fears of infections in nursing homes, and push offices to rethink plans of reopening. The Biden administration is expanding its effort to find and reunite migrant families who were separated at the U.S.-Mexico border under President Trump. A federal task force is launching a new program today to step up efforts to find parents and help them return to the United States. The task force has reunited about 50 families since February, but officials say as many as 2,000 parents who were separated from their kids have not been located. The state of Louisiana is facing another storm and potential flash floods 2 weeks after being battered by Hurricane Ida. A state of emergency has been declared because of Tropical Storm Nicholas, which formed in the Gulf of Mexico. Nicholas has triggered a storm surge warning along the Texas coast. Heavy rainfall and possible flash floods are expected in southwest Louisiana through the middle of the week. 2 weeks before Germans go to the polls, center-left frontrunner Olaf Scholz fended off attacks over his track record as finance minister and strengthened his position as the most likely successor to Chancellor Angela Merkel. Scholz's rival from Merkel's conservative bloc, Armin Laschet, had been a strong favorite to win the chancellorship after clinching the Conservatives' nomination in April, but his campaign has been undermined by a series of high-profile gaffes. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thank you so much, Mark. Tomorrow is the day for voters to decide on the California recall petition. And if polls are to be believed, what was touch and go for Governor Gavin Newsom now looks very likely to go his way. For a preview of what to expect and its potential importance, we welcome now an expert on California politics, Jack Pitney. He's Claremont McKenna College professor of American politics. So, Professor, thanks so much for being with us. As I say, we were reporting until not too far long ago that things were too close to call. Now it looks like he may be pulling ahead in the polls, Gavin Newsom. What happened?
One thing that happened was Larry Elder. He decided to run in the replacement ballot, which is a separate line on the ballot that California has.